The ship was rolling 40 degrees to the port side. Then it rolled 40 degrees to the starboard side. We had no power to the propeller. The rudder was useless because there was no water moving past it. Every time a wave hit the hull, the ship drifted closer to the rocky coastline. The bridge telegraph was ringing for full ahead, but the needle stayed at 0. The main engine had stopped without any warning. 1 second the deck was vibrating with power, and the next second it was completely still. A small steel taper pin in the fuel linkage had snapped. It was a piece of metal only 3 inches long. When it broke, the fuel racks moved to the shutoff position. The engine starved for oil and died. The silence in the engine room was loud and heavy. This happened in 1984 on a bulk carrier entering the Minch, a stretch of water near Scotland. I was the 3rd engineer on watch at the time. I was 28 years old, and I had been at sea for 6 years. We were carrying 30,000 tons of iron ore. The ship was heavy and moved slowly in the water. I stood on the bottom floor plates of the engine room. My boots were slipping on a thin layer of oil. I could smell the hot grease and the heavy fuel oil. The smell was always there, but it felt stronger now that the ventilation fans had stopped. I grabbed the cold steel handrail to keep from falling as the ship tipped over. My knuckles were white from gripping the rail so hard. The emergency generator started up above us. I heard the high-pitched whine of the smaller engine. The lights flickered and then turned a dim yellow color. This gave us enough power for the pumps and some lights, but it could not move the ship. I looked up at the main engine. It was a massive block of iron, 3 stories high. It was useless now. Before I tell you how we tried to restart the dead engine in the middle of a gale, please take a second to subscribe to these stories so you do not miss the next one from the old days at sea. I ran to the fuel rack linkage. The ship gave a violent lurch to the right. I tripped over a pipe and landed on my knees. The steel deck was hard and cold. I scrambled back up and reached the side of the engine. I looked at the long steel rod that controlled the fuel. I saw the hole where the pin should be. The pin was gone. The linkage was hanging loose. Without that pin, the governor could not tell the engine to take more fuel. I reached out and tried to move the rack by hand. It was heavy. It was held back by a strong spring. I pulled on it with all my strength. I could feel the rough metal biting into my palms. My hands were covered in black grease. The grease made it hard to get a grip. Every time the ship rolled, I had to let go to catch myself. I was sweating and the salt was stinging my eyes. The 2nd engineer came running down the ladder. He was shouting, but I could barely hear him over the sound of the waves crashing against the hull outside. The hull made a deep, booming sound every time the water hit us. It sounded like the ship was being hit by a giant hammer. The air in the engine room was getting hotter. The heat felt thick in my throat. It seemed impossible to fix this while the ship was tossing like a toy in the bath, but you won't believe how we managed to get those fuel racks to stay open using nothing but a crowbar and some old wire. The 2nd engineer reached the fuel rack. He saw the broken linkage. He wiped his forehead with a dirty rag. The rag left a streak of black oil across his face. He looked at me and shook his head. He tried to push the rack forward, but the spring was too strong. We needed to get the engine started immediately. The bridge was calling on the internal phone. The phone was ringing a sharp, constant sound. I picked up the phone. It was the chief officer. He sounded frightened. He told me the wind was blowing at 60 knots. We were less than 2 miles from the rocks. He said the waves were breaking over the bow. He needed the engine now, or we would be on the beach in less than 20 minutes. I hung up the phone. My hand was shaking. I could feel the vibration of the ship's hull groaning under the pressure of the sea. The chief engineer arrived next. He was an older man with gray hair and a calm face. He looked at the broken pin. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the linkage and then at the floor plates. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flashlight. The beam of light was steady, even though the ship was tilting. He pointed the light into the hole of the linkage. The metal was shiny where the pin had sheared off. "We cannot replace the pin," the chief said. His voice was flat and factual. "The hole is misaligned. If we try to hammer a new one in, we will bend the rod. Then we are truly finished." The ship took a massive roll to the port side. I heard crates of spare parts falling over in the storeroom. The sound of metal hitting metal echoed through the engine room. We were all thrown against the side of the engine. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder as I hit a valve handle. I didn't care about the pain. I only cared about the engine. The chief engineer looked at me. "You and the second have to hold it," he said. "You have to move the fuel racks manually while I try to start the air." I looked at the long row of fuel pumps. There were 6 of them. They were all connected by the same rod. To get enough power to move the ship, we had to push that rod and hold it against the pressure of the spring. If we let go, the engine would stop again instantly. I grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the tool rack. It was about 4 feet long and very heavy. My hands were slick with oil, so I wrapped a piece of waste rag around the handle. I jammed the end of the bar into the linkage. I pushed with my shoulder. The rod moved an inch. The spring fought back. I could feel the tension in my back muscles. The second engineer grabbed a length of copper wire from a shelf. He began to wrap it around the bar to give us more leverage. The smell of the hot engine oil was making me feel sick, but I held my breath. We were standing on a narrow walkway, high up on the engine. If we fell, we would drop 20 feet onto the crankshaft housing. The chief went to the control console. He put his hand on the air start lever. He looked back at us. He raised his hand. That was the signal. We had to hold the fuel open while he blew high-pressure air into the cylinders to get the massive pistons moving. The ship dropped into a deep trough between waves. My feet left the floor for a split second. I gripped the bar. My muscles were screaming. I could hear the air whistling through the pipes. The whole ship felt like it was dying. We were out of time. The chief engineer pulled the air start lever. I heard the hiss of high-pressure air entering the cylinders. It was a loud, rushing sound that filled the entire engine room. The massive flywheel began to turn slowly. I felt the vibration through the soles of my boots. The ship was still rolling heavily. I leaned my entire body weight against the steel crowbar. The metal was cold and hard against my shoulder. The engine groaned. It was a deep, metallic sound. The cylinders were cold, and the heavy fuel oil was thick. The first few revolutions did not catch. The air start system was using up the stored pressure in the tanks. I looked at the pressure gauge on the wall. The needle was dropping. If we ran out of air before the engine started, we would be completely helpless. The smell of unburnt fuel began to fill the air. It was a sharp chemical smell that made my eyes water. I pushed harder on the bar. My feet were slipping on the oily plates. I had to plant my heels against a bolt head to keep from sliding. The second engineer was right next to me. I could hear his heavy breathing. He was sweating. The sweat was dripping off his chin and onto the front of his boiler suit. Then there was a loud thump. The engine had fired on one cylinder. The ship shook violently. The vibration was different now. It was the rhythm of the engine trying to live. Another cylinder fired, then another. Black smoke puffed out of the relief valves. The noise was deafening in the small space. We were only 3 feet away from the moving parts. The engine was finally running, but it was not steady. Because we were holding the fuel rack by hand, the RPM was jumping up and down. The governor was not controlling the speed. We were the governor. If we pushed too hard, the engine would overspeed and explode. If we did not push hard enough, the engine would stall and die again. The heat began to rise quickly. The engine block was radiating heat like a giant stove. I felt the skin on my face getting tight and dry. My arms were already starting to ache. The tension in the fuel rack spring was constant. It wanted to pull the rod back to the stop position. It felt like I was trying to hold back a moving truck with a single piece of iron. The chief engineer stood at the controls. He was watching the RPM gauge and the exhaust temperature dials. He looked over at us. He could see we were struggling. The vibration of the engine was traveling up the crowbar and into my bones. My hands were turning numb from the shaking. I had to keep repositioning my grip because the grease was making the bar slippery. It was a terrible choice. We could keep holding the bar and hope our muscles didn't give out, or we could try to lash it permanently and risk the engine running away out of control. If the engine overspeeded, it could throw a connecting rod through the side of the block. That would kill us and sink the ship. What would you have done? The chief decided we had to keep holding it manually until we reached safer water. He signaled for me and the second engineer to switch positions slightly so we didn't cramp up. As we moved, the ship took a massive hit from a wave. The hull made a sound like a drum. I lost my footing. My boots slid across the deck. The crowbar slipped. The fuel rack snapped back toward the zero position. The engine RPM dropped instantly. The lights in the engine room dimmed as the load changed. I scrambled on my hands and knees to grab the bar again. My fingers hit the hot metal of the engine block. I felt the skin burn, but I did not let go. I jammed the bar back into the linkage and shoved it forward. The engine coughed and sputtered. For a second, I thought it was going to stop. The second engineer grabbed the bar with me. We both pushed with everything we had. The engine caught again. The steady beat returned. We were both panting now. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil and sweat. We thought we had a system. We thought we could hold it. But then we heard a new sound. It was a snapping noise. The copper wire the second engineer had used to help secure the bar had reached its limit. The vibration had hardened the metal until it was brittle. The wire broke and whipped through the air. It missed my eye by only 2 inches. Without the wire, the bar was even harder to hold. The vibration was now so intense that I could feel it in my teeth. My jaw was clamped shut. My shirt was soaked through with sweat. It was dripping into my eyes, making them sting. I couldn't wipe it away because I couldn't let go of the bar. The bridge phone rang again. The chief answered it. He listened for a moment and then looked at us. His face was pale under the dim yellow lights. He told us the news. We were less than half a mile from the rocks now. The current was stronger than the engine's current output. We were moving forward, but we were still being pushed toward the shore. "We need more power," the chief shouted. "You have to push the rack further. We need full ahead." I looked at the second engineer. We both knew what that meant. If we pushed the rack to the full ahead position, the pressure on the bar would double. The heat would increase. The vibration would become even more violent. We were already at the limit of our physical strength. I looked down at the floor plates. There was a pool of oil and water swirling around my boots as the ship rolled. The noise of the engine was so loud I could no longer hear the storm outside. I could only feel the ship fighting against the water. Every time the bow hit a wave, the engine slowed down, and we had to push even harder to keep it from stalling. My muscles began to shake uncontrollably. This is what happens when you push a human body too far. My shoulders felt like they were on fire. I looked at my hands. They were black with grease and blood from where the metal had chafed the skin. I didn't think I could hold it for another 5 minutes. The ship gave another massive lurch. This time I heard a loud grinding sound from the stern. It was the rudder hitting the limit of its travel. We were turning, but it was too slow. We were still heading for the rocks. The chief engineer looked at the gauges. The exhaust temperatures were climbing into the red zone. The engine was overheating because we were pushing it so hard. "It's not enough," the chief yelled. He ran over to the tool rack and started looking for something. He was moving fast, tripping over the pipes on the floor. He was looking for a way to fix the linkage permanently while the engine was still moving. I felt the bar moving in my hands. The linkage was starting to bend under the pressure. If the rod bent, the fuel would stay stuck in one position and we would lose all control. We were minutes away from hitting the coast of Scotland. All our standard tools were useless now. The standard fix had failed. We were in total desperation. The chief engineer returned from the workshop carrying a heavy 12-inch C-clamp and a length of flat steel bar. The flat bar was about 2 feet long and very heavy. He had found it in the scrap bin. He also had a roll of thick duct tape and a pair of vice grips. He dropped the tools onto the deck plates. They made a loud ringing sound as they hit the steel. The heat near the engine was now over 50 degrees Celsius. The paint on the fuel pump housings was starting to smell. It was a sweet, sickly smell of burning chemicals. The vibration of the engine at full ahead was so strong that my vision was becoming blurry. I could feel the pulse of the fuel flowing through the high-pressure pipes. The pipes were hot to the touch. "We're going to bridge the gap," the chief shouted into my ear. I could feel his hot breath. "We will use the flat bar as a brace against the engine frame. Then we will use the clamp to push the fuel rack forward." It was a simple plan, but it was dangerous. We had to put our hands into the moving machinery. The fuel rack linkage was moving back and forth a few millimeters with every stroke of the engine. If the clamp slipped, it could be thrown like a piece of shrapnel. I shifted my weight. My knees were shaking from the effort of holding the crowbar. The muscles in my thighs were starting to cramp. The ship rolled again. A wave hit the side of the hull and the ship shuddered. I heard the sound of water rushing over the deck far above us. The chief engineer knelt on the greasy plates. He placed the flat steel bar across 2 bolts on the engine frame. He tried to hold it steady, but the vibration made the bar dance. It made a rattling sound that was higher than the deep roar of the engine. The second engineer took the C-clamp. It was an old tool, covered in gray paint and rust. The screw thread was dry and gritty. He began to turn the handle to open the jaws. I could hear the dry metal grinding. He put a drop of engine oil on the thread to make it move smoother. The smell of the fresh oil mixed with the smell of the hot paint. We had to coordinate our movements. I was still holding the crowbar with all my strength. My hands were so numb I could no longer feel the metal. I was just a weight leaning against the bar. The second engineer reached past my arm. He placed the C-clamp over the fuel rack and the flat bar brace. "Now!" the chief yelled. I eased back on the crowbar just a little. The C-clamp took the pressure. The second engineer turned the handle. He turned it 1 full rotation, then another. I could see the steel of the clamp beginning to flex. The tension was immense. The fuel rack was now being held in place by the clamp instead of my tired muscles. I slowly let go of the crowbar. My fingers stayed in the shape of the bar. I could not straighten them right away. I stepped back and leaned against the cold steel of the bulkhead. I was breathing hard. The air was thick and tasted like exhaust fumes. My chest felt tight. The fix was holding for now. The engine RPM stabilized. The chief engineer watched the clamp. Every time the engine vibrated, the clamp moved a fraction of a millimeter. He took the duct tape and began to wrap it around the handle of the clamp. He did this so the vibration would not cause the screw to turn itself open. The tape was silver and shiny under the dim lights. We stood there and watched it. We didn't talk. The only sound was the steady thump, thump, thump of the 6 large cylinders. I looked at the second engineer. His boiler suit was dark with sweat. He looked like he had been standing in the rain. We were all exhausted. The bridge phone rang. The chief answered it. He listened for a long time. Then he looked at us and gave a small nod. His face was still stern, but the tension in his jaw had relaxed. "We are clearing the point," he said. "The captain says we have 3 miles of sea room now. The current is no longer pushing us toward the rocks." I felt a massive sense of relief. It felt like a physical weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I looked at the C-clamp. It was a small piece of hardware, but it was the only thing keeping the ship from drifting into the Scottish coast. I could see the grease on the tons. Rack linkage beginning to smoke from the heat. We stayed in the engine room for the next 4 hours. We did not trust the clamp to hold without supervision. We took turns sitting on a wooden crate watching the linkage. Every 20 minutes, the second engineer would check the tension on the clamp. He would give the handle a tiny turn to make sure it was still tight. The vibration continued to rattle my brain. I could feel it in my feet through the soles of my boots. I could feel it in the stool I sat on. The noise was constant. It was a wall of sound that made it impossible to think about anything else. I watched a small leak from a cooling water pipe. The water was dripping onto a hot manifold and turning into steam. Drip, hiss, drip, hiss. By the time the sun began to come up, the storm had started to lose its power. The rolls were no longer 40 degrees. They were only 20 degrees. The ship felt more stable. We had reached a sheltered area where the water was calmer. The chief engineer called the bridge and told them we were going to stop the engine to make a more permanent repair. When the engine finally stopped, the silence was strange. It felt like my ears were ringing. I could hear the sound of my own heart beating. We spent the next 3 hours drilling out the broken taper pin. It was hard work. We had to use a hand drill because there was no room for a power tool. My arms were tired, but the work was steady and quiet. We found a new pin in the spare parts drawer. It was a small piece of polished steel. It looked too small to be so important. We tapped it into the hole with a small hammer. Tink, tink, tink. The sound was light and sharp. Once the pin was in, the governor was connected to the fuel racks again. The mechanical system was whole. We restarted the engine. This time the governor handled the fuel. The racks moved smoothly back and forth on their own. We no longer needed the crowbar or the C-clamp. I picked up the clamp. It was still hot. I put it back on the tool board. It looked like any other tool, but I knew it had saved us. We found out later why the pin had sheared. It was a manufacturing defect. There was a tiny air bubble inside the steel of the pin. Over years of vibration, that bubble had turned into a crack. The storm was just the final stress that caused it to snap. It was a tiny flaw in a 30,000-ton ship, but it nearly caused a disaster. I went up to the galley to get a cup of coffee. The sun was hitting the water, and the waves were topped with white foam. The coastline of Scotland was a dark line on the horizon. It looked peaceful from a distance. You would never know how close we came to being smashed against those rocks. I sat at the mess table. My hands were still stained black with grease. No matter how much I scrubbed with the orange hand cleaner, the oil stayed in the cracks of my skin. My shoulder ached where I had hit the valve. I took a sip of the hot coffee. It was strong and bitter. It was the best coffee I had ever tasted. I stayed at sea for another 20 years. After that night, I saw many more breakdowns and many more storms, but I never forgot the feeling of that crowbar in my hands. I never forgot the sight of that C-clamp holding our lives together. It taught me that on a ship, you have to be ready to use whatever you have. You cannot always wait for a spare part to come from a box. Have you ever had to fix something like this with your bare hands? Tell me your story in the comments.